One of the things about this issue, this modern slavery, human trafficking issue, that's really near and dear to me is it's fundamentally about people with more power taking advantage of people with less power for profit.
Human trafficking doesn't always take the form we first imagine. It can be found at almost any level of an organization's supply chain. What can compliance professionals do to assess human trafficking risk, and how can they leverage the resources of the organizations they work for to help root out this tragic problem? Gwen Hassan is here to help. This is Hidden Traffic.
Hello and welcome to Hidden Traffic. This is Gwen Hassan. I'm excited today to have as my guest Laura Gauer Bermudez. She is the Director of Evidence and Learning for the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery. Hi, Laura.
Hi, Gwen. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. I love your title, by the way.
Thank you.
I mean, Director of Evidence and Learning. That's a title I have never heard before. That's
really?
Yeah. I hear lots of, Director of Learning titles, but the evidence is the new part for me.
Yeah, the evidence is something that we added into the title because it is such a huge part of what's needed in this sector dealing with modern slavery issues, because there had not been a lot of evidence around it. And it's so important to have that evidence when you're speaking with stakeholders, when you're speaking with government, to say, here are the numbers, here are the stories, this is an issue and we need to do something about it. So we've really been pushing on the evidence angle to be a fund produces and invests in and uses evidence for influence.
That's one of the things that has stood out to me, because this is the fourth podcast with somebody from GFEMS.
Great.
Because we had some of your colleagues on earlier. And it's been really interesting to see that reliance on data and on hard evidence kind of driving where the organization is going. But I'd like to talk first a little bit about you and your background.
Sure.
So how did you get drawn to work in human trafficking?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I have been working in human rights and humanitarian assistance, that world, for a while, for almost 20 years at this point now. Worked on refugee resettlement issues, women's empowerment, child protection, a variety of places around the world. And I think one of the things about this issue, this modern slavery, human trafficking issue, that's really near and dear to me is it's fundamentally about people with more power taking advantage of people with less power for profit. And it's something that often these are folks of some sort of minority status, whether it's ethnic minority, religious minority, gender minority, etc. And that sort of exploitation and power differential is something that is really, really important for me to address. I feel like it's an issue of fairness, it's an issue of justice. And so this particular topic really was one to put a lot of time and energy in because of that.
I can understand that. I had somebody the other day talking with me about human trafficking describe it as the marginalized being used by the privileged. And I thought that was an interesting way to look at it, right?
Yeah.
People that are on the kind of fringes of society without much power being used for profit by people who are in power. So how did you come to be at GFEMS? So you started with some other organizations first, and then how long have you been with GFEMS?
Sure. So I've been with GFEMS for almost 4 years.
Okay.
And I had done work previously working on child labor issues at the U.S. Department of Labor back 2009-ish, 2010, and had heard about GFEMS through some colleagues from there. And I had been doing work with NGOs, consultancy work, and I had just finished my PhD where I'd been doing a lot of work on statistics and research around issues that were interesting to me. And they said, hey, this job popped up at GFEMS. It's working on modern slavery. They're looking for someone to lead and build their research unit. And I said, that sounds like a fantastic job and something I would love to do. So we built this evidence and learning unit from scratch, hired everyone on, designed what it would look like, designed what we wanted to do. And here we are 4 years later with a number of knowledge products and research products on our website that people should definitely check out when they're able.
I love it when people do this. You effectively wrote your own job description then, right? Yeah, I mean, you kind of created your own role. That's excellent. By
Yeah.
the way, I feel like I should have referred to you as Dr. Gauer Bermudez then. With the
Oh,
PhD.
you're
I'm
welcome to.
sorry.
Either way is fine. Either way is fine.
No, that PhD is a lot of work. You earned the
It
doctor.
is.
I should.
It
Yeah.
is.
When I spoke with some of your colleagues, specifically Irene, she was talking about the fact that, well, I had talked about how, hey, this is in reference to human trafficking, and here's what I want to talk about. And she very gently corrected me on a few things and said, hey, you know what? Human trafficking is not the same as modern slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a real difference between the two of them. And I have always used them as synonyms for each other.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of people in the compliance space do that. Mm-hmm. But I understand that's not really the case. So could you explain for our listeners kind of what the difference is between the two and what the danger is of lumping them all together?
I'd be happy to. I think this is a topic where a lot of people get confused because a lot of people use them in different ways. So what I can do is I'll give you a little bit of an overview of the different terms and where they come from and how to best kind of sort between them. Essentially, the modern slavery term is something that's been brought into the conversation maybe 10, 12 years ago. The UN and other international organizations had brought it into the conversation as this big umbrella term, right? Kind of a big tent term to talk about numerous kinds of exploitation that would fall underneath it. So that include human trafficking, forced labor, commercial sexual exploitation, as well as forced marriage. So they said, we're going to use this topic of modern slavery and everything underneath it has its own sort of separate definitions, but we want a big tent name so that when we talk about this issue, people can say, this is the issue of exploitation. We want to deal with this at large, and we needed this big tent name. Now, one of the things that I think is really interesting about modern slavery is that today there's a lot of discussion in the US about whether or not it's an appropriate term. I think some folks have said it is being used as a parallel with the transatlantic slave trade. And they're saying we don't necessarily feel comfortable with that. There's no parallel to this concept of someone being bought and sold and owned as property. And that's something that I think a lot of folks in the US are trying to figure out, is this the right term? If it is not, what would we change it to? It's interesting because it really depends on location, right? So this is a conversation that's being held in the US, one that we're thinking about really critically. And then you go to a place like Brazil and they use the term slavery. They have it in their legislation. It's one that they continue to use. So it's very...
Well, and in the UK too, right? That's the name of their act, is the Modern Slavery Act.
That's right. The UK, Australia, some other places have called it the Modern Slavery Act when they want to put a big statement out about all these areas of exploitation.
Do you think the difference is cultural? So that, I mean, in the context of kind of the reckoning that we're seeing in the US around Black Lives Matter and the movement towards more equity and more diversity and inclusion, that it's almost an insult? Is that the idea, to refer to what's happening today as being parallel to the buying and selling of people from Africa during the slave trade here in the United States? Is that where the sensitivity is coming from?
Sure. I think that's a big part of it. And I think whenever people say we're uncomfortable with the term or we're not sure this is the right term, the best thing we can do is listen, to say we want to hear you, we want to hear your thoughts on this, and to strongly consider what would it mean to change it and what are the thoughts around it, and is there a viable alternative for this big tent term, and really just listen to people. And I think there's a number of organizations that have been writing about this, that have been thinking critically about it, the Attest Coalition and others, that I think are great to take a read on and to understand, because language does matter, and we want to make sure that the language that we're using is inclusive of everyone's thoughts and opinions about what's valuable and viable.
Does the concept of human trafficking, does it encompass the idea of both forced labor and sexual exploitation within it? And is it a big term, or is it a sub-term of slavery?
Yeah, so absolutely. So let me explain. So if you consider modern slavery as the big tent, you've got human trafficking here. Human trafficking is, and just for kind of background for listeners, came into the conversation in 2000 through something called the Palermo Protocol. It was a declaration by the UN to say, essentially, I think in the shortest of terms, the recruitment, transport, transfer, harboring, or receipt of persons using force, fraud, or coercion for the purposes of exploitation. They said, this is an issue. We're bringing it to the forefront. Countries that sign on to this need to then create a law within their own country to address human trafficking. And so human trafficking, where you will see it used most is in conversations about prosecution, because this is where a lot of people have the laws. A lot of people will criminally prosecute under human trafficking charges. And so when you're talking about the legal repercussions, when you're talking about prosecution, you start to talk a little bit more about human trafficking. The other term that I'll introduce, and then we can go back, is forced labor, right? And there's a little bit of crossover, but forced labor, that's an ILO convention. The International Labor Organization in 1930 said, here's forced labor. What this is anyone working with involuntariness, so not in a voluntary way, and under the menace of penalty. There's a bunch of different indicators. If you go online and say, what are the indicators of the ILO Forced Labor Convention, you'll get them. That's something that businesses need to understand. They need to know. So I think when you're wanting to understand the legal repercussions, you will kind of look at human trafficking. When you want to understand sort of the larger global standards and indicators for forced labor, you'll go to the ILO definition.
Is it right to think of forced labor as a subset of human trafficking, or are they fundamentally different? And if so, how?
I would actually flip it and say human trafficking is a subset of forced labor. I think that forced labor is a little bit of a broader category, and that most people would say it has to be maybe a little bit harsher, a little bit more intense to be considered human trafficking. So there are some aspects of forced labor on things like wage withholding and other aspects that may not necessarily be severe enough to be counted as human trafficking under court of law.
Is the primary difference between them transportation?
You've touched on a real hot spot, because I think for a long time, most people would say, yes, like if there's some sort of transport movement of humans, then we move from it being a forced labor case to being a human trafficking case, right? Yeah. And I think that's been sort of in the minds of folks for a very long time. Several years ago, the US government interpreted the Palermo Protocol in a little bit of a new way. And they said, we don't feel like transport is necessary, and we will prosecute a human trafficking case even if transport is not there. So they really honed in on the harboring language. It says transport, receipt, harboring, or, right? So it's giving you a list and an or. And they said, we're going to look at this list. We're going to look at the or. And if someone's harboring, which means they're just keeping people in a factory and they're working there, we're still going to call that human trafficking, and we're going to prosecute under it. So it's not necessary to have transport in the US's definition. So
is that, I think I already know the answer, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Is that interpretation unique to the US, or do you see it varying among different jurisdictions? Like if we had the same set of facts, no transport but harboring in the US, would it hold water the same way legally as it would in Brazil or in the UK or Australia?
It's a great question. So it definitely holds water in the US. It's not really clear to me. And again, I'm not a legal scholar, so let me put that caveat in, and I haven't done sort of the background legal research. I see it less in other countries, but that doesn't mean it just takes one case to set a precedent, right? So as soon as one case goes through, then you've got a precedent, and then more people will do it. And I think you may start seeing that happen more and more, especially if countries feel like they don't have another great option, legislative option that has a lot of teeth. And so they really want to prosecute this crime, but they're not sure how to do it. You might see people moving towards using human trafficking more, then you set the precedent, and then more people start doing it. But it's very, very country specific.
So how then, as a compliance professional who's sitting in-house and trying to draft a policy or a process or a procedure that's going to work everywhere, what's your best advice for how people do that? Because theoretically, you could have 180 different human trafficking policies that are country specific. And I will tell you, as someone who's been in-house for a long time, that's never going to happen. You want one global policy that's going to hit the highest point that you can. So do you include trafficking as something you prohibit? Do you specifically list out harboring as something? What are your thoughts on that?
So my thoughts on this is that if you're in a business and you are producing, manufacturing, et cetera, providing service, I would go with forced labor and I would go with the ILO definition because it is universal, it is global, it is standardized, and it is what most ESG professionals are going to be using when they're thinking about social accountability and human rights due diligence. So you're safe if you stick with the ILO definition.
Okay. That's good practical advice. That's something most people can do.
Sure. Good. I want to make this easy for people.
There's some amount of certainty somewhere. I like it.
Yes.
That's good.
Yes.
But I mean, the reality will be if we stick with that ILO definition, there's still some risk to a corporation that they could end up with kind of a broader set of enforcement, at least in the US, right? Because if we use the Forced Labor Convention definition, would the definition be enough to satisfy the harboring part of the US enforcement approach?
I would think so. And here's my perspective on this. Because the forced labor definition is broader, you're setting a lower baseline,
a lower bar. Okay.
A lower bar. So you're going to catch things that are not necessarily trafficking that might exist up here. You're already going to catch it because you're going a little bit lower down here. You're looking at wage withholding. You're looking at a number of things that maybe would not have been considered trafficking. So if you go with the lowest bar, you catch everything.
Interesting. Okay. I like that. That makes sense to me because if you are using the broadest definition possible, it's like the biggest net, pull everything under and make sure that you're covering it. That leads to kind of my next question. And you mentioned it briefly when you were just talking ESG and the fact that we're seeing some real movement with the standards organizations to move towards a uniform set of reporting guidelines and data, which is exciting. Do you think that we'll end up there when it comes to forced labor and human trafficking? Will there be a convergence of definitions so there isn't this jurisdictional difference from country to country, or is that overly hopeful thinking? What do you think?
Well, I would say this. It might be overly hopeful thinking in terms of all of the terms, human trafficking, modern slavery, forced labor, et cetera, getting some sort of consensus about how they all fit together. That might be overly hopeful. What I would say, though, is that there is a lot of hope in terms of the ILO forced labor definition. Again, it's standard, it's universal. And I would imagine that the ISSB, if their sustainability standards are going to include social accountability, which they likely will, they will tap into the ILO indicators on forced labor.
Oh, let's hope so.
I hope so. I'll be very interested to see. But yes, those are the most standardized indicators out there.
Are you aware of anyone yet within the kind of NGO world or human trafficking world having reached out to ISSB and said, hey, by the way, we suggest that you do this?
I haven't, but it might be worthwhile to do that because I think that would be really great. Oftentimes, the S in the ESG, the social component, gets overlooked. And so really ensuring a very robust understanding of human rights due diligence, social accountability, forced labor issues, really important. So I think that's a really great idea, and maybe we'll do that.
Maybe we should. Yeah, that move towards duality of impact, I think, is going to be so important because ESG, at least in the US, for a long time, has only looked at financial impact. It's that kind of singular, if it's financially material, then we'll disclose and we'll report on it. But if it's kind of the EU model has for a while now been, no, you have to also look at what the impact is on society and the communities that you're operating in and the people that work for you and your customers. And there's kind of a much broader view of what material means, and that dual materiality of not just financial, but also social, I think is what will really kind of save and bring in all of the often overlooked S, including forced labor and human trafficking. So
Absolutely. And I love this idea of standardization too, because then when you're looking at companies, you're not comparing apples and oranges, but you're comparing apples and apples. You're able, and as a researcher too, that kind of standardization is incredibly helpful to be able to do accurate comparisons.
Yeah, there's some data out there. Actually, I'm teaching an ESG course right now for a law school here in Chicago. And we pulled some data about how different ratings agencies are rating the same company, an ESG standpoint.
Okay.
And it's just stark because the exact same company, the exact same year, one rating agency is rating them as, fantastic and responsible. And the other ratings agency is rating them as, at the bottom of the barrel. These people are barely have a program. And it's been that way for years now. And that disparity of ratings and standards is really impacting the ability to do that comparison from a shareholder standpoint, from a consumer standpoint. All of those things are missing.
I'm really looking forward to this effort. I think that that's great.
Me too. Thank you so much for joining me today. This has been educational for me, if not for anybody else.
Glad. Good. I'm glad. Anytime. Happy to do it.
So where can people get more information about GFEMS or contact you directly if they want to?
Yes, definitely come to our website, gfems.org. We have a whole research page. You can go on there, click around, find issues that you're interested in. And one thing that we do that I wanted to mention too is we take long research projects and articles and we condense them into very short briefs so that they're very easy for people to digest, 1, 2, 4 pages. So come on our website, have a look, see if there's anything useful to you. People can reach out to me absolutely at any time. My email is laura.bermudez@gfems.org.
Thank you very much. I appreciate all of your guidance and wisdom today and your time as well.
Anytime. You're welcome. Take care.
You too.